Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at a pretty incredible true story of a grassroots movement that brought the entire British government completely to its knees. We're going to explore the 1915 Glasgow Rent Strikes. It is an absolute masterclass in organization, solidarity, and direct action. Okay, let's dive into this, because this is just a fascinating story of a true David versus Goliath conflict. Think about it. At the absolute height of the First World War, with the entire might of the British Empire totally focused on a global conflict, how exactly did a group of working-class women in Scotland force the hands of the nation's most powerful politicians? Well, the answer really comes down to the sheer, staggering scale of the resistance. By the peak of his whole movement in late 1915, an astonishing 30,000 tenants were on strike. I mean, let that number sink in for a second. This wasn't just a handful of disgruntled renters, This was a massive, highly disciplined movement that simply became way too big to fail. Section 1. The 1915 Housing Crisis. So, to understand why they succeeded, we first have to look at the massive pressure cooker that was World War I Glasgow. The city was facing this crisis that had honestly been brewing for decades, but it was suddenly pushed way past the breaking point. Glasgow was a major industrial hub, right? And as the war raged on, thousands of men and their families were pouring into the city to work in the rapidly expanding munitions factories and shipyards. But here was the huge problem. The supply of housing was completely stagnant. With local men away at war, this intense supply and demand crisis gave property owners the perfect excuse to significantly raise prices on the working class. And we have to remember, these were absolutely not luxurious homes. Most working-class families were densely packed into single-room tenement flats. We're talking incredibly overcrowded slums where several families might have to share just a single stairhead toilet. And with their husbands away fighting, the women were left totally alone to balance the family budget in these incredibly harsh conditions. The actual breaking point came in February 1915. Landlords and their enforcers, who were known locally as factors, brazenly announced a 25% rent hike. I mean, for families who were already struggling just to feed their kids on wartime rations, this increase was completely unaffordable. It was basically an eviction notice by another name. Section 2. Women take the lead. Now, the second pillar of their success was just this brilliant, localized organization. They didn't just sit back and accept these hikes. No, they fought back with incredible tactical precision. The structural backbone of this entire resistance was the Glasgow Women's Housing Association. And they didn't just pop up overnight out of nowhere. They were formed out of existing community networks to actively resist rent increases, fight evictions, and push for subsidized municipal housing. They were highly organized, they were motivated, and they were more than ready for a fight. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing who actually stepped up to the plate. You had key, fierce leaders like Mary Barbour, Agnes Dolan, Mary Burns-Laird, and Helen Crawford. Because working-class women were intimately tied to their communities and managing the household day-to-day, they managed to turn their tenement networks into a highly disciplined neighborhood-by-neighborhood army. And hey, they absolutely weren't afraid to get physical. The sources share this fantastic historical anecdote about a rent factor who was literally chased out of the Partick neighborhood entirely. By the time the women were done throwing things at him, he was described as looking like, quote, a grain store in disorder. The guy was completely covered head to toe in flour. Section 3. Tactics of the Strike. These women developed street-level strategies that made the rent strikes practically unbreakable. Their overall strategy was brilliantly simple. First, they actually didn't withhold all the rent, just that 25% increase, which proved they were perfectly willing to pay a fair price. Second, they created this amazing early warning system. Whenever a factor or a sheriff's officer showed up to serve an eviction, women would start banging pots and pans together in the street. This signaled the whole neighborhood to instantly mobilize, throw those flower bombs, and physically block the narrow tenement stairs. The enforced collectivity of tenement living made this tactic highly effective. Well, because the women's physical blockades were so incredibly successful, the landlords quickly realized they just couldn't win on the streets, so they decided to pivot to a new legal tactic. They started going to the small claims court to get what were called wage arrestments, which is basically attempting to dock the owed rent directly from the paychecks of the working men. But actually, this new legal strategy is what ultimately triggered the landlord's own downfall. Section 4. Forging powerful alliances. And this brilliantly illustrates the third reason for the movement's success. They didn't fight alone. Housing united absolutely everyone. You had the housewives holding the line in the tenements, for sure, but now they were officially backed by the Independent Labor Party, the trades councils, and the massive industrial muscle of the shipyard and munitions workers. When those landlords tried to dock the men's wages, they accidentally brought the entire factory workforce into the fight. What's super fascinating here is how this shared struggle actually bypassed deep societal rifts. The sources emphasize that Glasgow's systemic anti-Irish and anti-Catholic bigotry was completely sidelined during this period. Leaders from the Independent Labor Party, like John Wheatley and Patrick Dolan, really helped unite the working class across these traditional religious divides. They focused everyone purely on the shared necessity of decent housing. Section 5. The November Court Climax. So all of these elements completely collided for an explosive climax in the winter of 1915. On November 17th, 18 munitions workers were summoned to court for those wage arrestments. In response, workers from the major shipyards and engineering works simply downed their tools. They marched right from the factories and linked up with the women's marches. By the time they reached the sheriff court, a crowd of 10,000 furious protesters had completely surrounded the building, stopping all traffic in its tracks. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was literally electric. Marxist teacher John McLean addressed the massive crowd and laid out a very strict ultimatum for the government. Either implement an immediate rent freeze or face a total general strike across Glasgow's vital war industries starting on November 22nd. Make no mistake, this was the ultimate pressure point for the British government. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Sheriff Lee realizes this isn't just a protest anymore. It's the brink of a full-blown uprising. He panics, gets on the phone, and calls the Minister of Munitions, David Lloyd George, all the way down in London. Lloyd George, who is absolutely terrified of losing munitions production during World War I, instantly orders the sheriff to drop all the cases and concede to the crowd's demands. Section 6. A historic housing victory. So, the crucial point is that the sheer scale of this alliance forced the British government into a profound shift in housing law. Just days after the protest, Parliament literally rushed through the Rent Restriction Act of 1915. This legally froze all rents at their August 1914 pre-war levels. The landlords' 25% hikes were totally defeated, and those striking tenants won an absolute historic victory. Now, you might be wondering why this matters so much today. Well, this strike effectively ended the unchecked free market for working-class urban rentals in Britain during the war. Not only that, but leaders like Wheatley and Dolan actually used the momentum from this huge victory to push for national municipal housing reform in the years that followed. They laid the direct groundwork for modern social housing as we know it. It's such an inspiring reminder of what collective action can actually achieve. By combining localized grassroots neighborhood resistance with wider industrial solidarity, the people of Glasgow completely changed history. Which leaves us with a pretty powerful thought to ponder. If ordinary tenants and working-class families could unite to defeat greedy property owners and the entire British government in 1915, what does that mean for how we approach our own housing crisis today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.